This presentation is about ground fire suppression. My name is Lars Lund. I am the Protection Forester for Bennington and Rutland counties and the State Forest Fire Supervisor for Vermont. In 2020, there were drought conditions lasting from midsummer through the fall, which resulted in more ground fires being reported as compared to previous years. And some of those fires proved difficult to extinguish. This presentation has information that can assist town forest fire wardens and local fire departments to safely and effectively extinguish these stubborn fires. This presentation will cover the following topics: the weather patterns that lead up to fire weather conditions where ground fires can occur and what starts these fires. We'll talk about the slow and deceptive fire behavior of ground fires and how combustion and fuel consumption occurs. Fire suppression will cover best practices to fully extinguishing ground fires, and we'll close out with mop-up and follow-up work. Let's start with the weather conditions that lead up to ground fires. This map represents the departure from normal precipitation in inches for Vermont and neighboring states from January to December of 2020. There was more than a 20-inch deficit in rain and snowfall equivalent of rain in the central and southern Green Mountains, as well as parts of the Northeast Kingdom and along the Canadian border. Except for the Champlain Valley, virtually all of Vermont had some degree of precipitation deficit in 2020, with much of the state at 8 to 12 inches below normal. This rain deficit began in May and has continued into the spring of 2021. During the 2020 spring fire season in March, April, and May, fine dead fuels such as grass that ignite and carry fire easily were overtaken by live green fuels, so the threat of surface fires diminished as the growing season progressed. But the fine dead fuels comprising the duff layer below these surface fuels became drier and drier as drought conditions persisted throughout Vermont into the fall of 2020. This graph shows the percent of Vermont week by week in some degree of drought from the year 2000 to March of 2021. Once winter finally departs, drought conditions will start showing up as rivers running low, pond levels dropping, lawns turning brown, wells drying up, and crops failing, and also ground fires starting to occur. Short duration rain events do not have a lasting impact on ground fuels once drought is underway. Flashy, intense rainstorms tend to have more runoff and less absorption into ground fuels when compared to the longer duration soaking rain events. A repeating pattern of several days without precipitation, interrupted by brief rain events, will have a cumulative drying effect on ground fuels and will result in drought conditions developing or worsening. Heading into the 2021 spring fire season, virtually all of Vermont is in some degree of drought. Spring fire season started several weeks ago in southern Vermont, and fires are now being reported in most parts of the state. This is an earlier start than the historical norm. As snowmelt completes and the ground thaws out, the current drought conditions will favor ground fires unless a wetter weather pattern develops. This potential for ground fires exists not only in portions of the state mapped as moderate drought, but also in smaller pockets on western and southern facing slopes that may have received less snow or rain than surrounding areas. Let's move on to ground fires and fire causes in Vermont. Year in and year out, debris burning and miscellaneous or grass fires are the two primary causes of wildland fire in Vermont. These fires are surface fires burning through dead grass and light brush, usually during spring fire season. Campfires and lightning are the traditional causes of ground fires here in Vermont. In 2020, 22% of the wildland fires reported were caused by campfires and lightning. 18 campfire starts and 3 lightning fires accounted for only 6% of the total acres burned. But some of these fires lingered for days or even weeks, and probably accounted for an outsized portion of the overall time spent responding to wildland fires by local fire departments. These ground fires were often in areas that were difficult to access, which allowed the fire to become well established in the duff layer before they were located by firefighters. Let's take a closer look at campfire starts. This graph shows the number of campfires reported annually from 2011 to 2020 in red, and the percentage of total wildland fires reported that were caused by campfires in green. The weekly drought conditions graph is in the background to highlight the relationship between drought conditions and ground fires. In 2016 and in 2020, the number of wildland fires caused by campfires was the highest for many years, as significant drought persisted from early summer into late fall during both of those years. And as was the case in 2016 and 2017, drought conditions in 2020 are persisting into the spring of 2021. In 2020, the combined effect of drought and more people out in the woods due to COVID restrictions on indoor activities and physical distancing were responsible for the increase in campfires that started wildland fires. Inexperienced hikers or campers may not have been aware of just how dry conditions were in the woods and may have lacked that backcountry knowledge or ethic needed to put out their campfire. This fire at Deer's Leap in Killington is believed to have been started by a campfire that was not fully extinguished. The duff layer in certain portions of the fire perimeter was quite deep, as shown by the chainsaw lying next to the control line. The duff layer was bone dry, and all burning or smoldering materials needed to be extinguished to prevent the fire from creeping across the control line. This fire was started by lightning striking the hemlock in the picture on the right. Lightning transmits a tremendous heat pulse into the ground that can cause surrounding surface or ground fuels to ignite. Lightning-caused fires have no correlation to human activity, so they can be in remote areas where suppression efforts are slowed by long hikes and little to no water availability. This fire spread slowly across the surface fuels and then transitioned into a ground fire when it encountered areas of dry duff, as shown in the picture on the left. The fires in the previous slides burned in the duff layer, one type of fine dead fuel. Fine dead fuels are generally described as 1-hour fuels, as shown on this chart. The chart shows the 4 size classes of wildland fuel, determined by how long it takes the dead fuel to lose enough moisture to become combustible. But these size classes describe the drying times needed for wildland fires to burn in surface fuels, not ground fuels. Only the fine dead surface fuels ignite easily and spread rapidly after 1 hour of drying. Ground fuels under normal conditions are damp due to snowmelt in the spring and irregular rain events during the growing season. During a drought, all of the duff layer, consisting of partially decomposed needles, leaves, twigs, bark, and other plant-based materials, can become dry enough to carry a creeping, smoldering ground fire. To track the potential for ground fires, the calculated moisture content in the 1,000-hour size of wildland fuels is used. At 3 inches or larger in diameter, these 1,000-hour fuels have significant interior volume that takes a long time to dry out. For example, think about the amount of time needed to properly season your firewood. Lowering the moisture content in these larger pieces of fuel above ground relates directly to the drying out of a duff layer several inches thick below ground. Unlike the fast-moving surface fires burning in grass and brush, ground fires will burn much slower and much hotter. Note the graph above shows temperatures in the upper 2 centimeters of soil for various types of fire. Peak soil temperatures during a grass or shrub fire is only 200 degrees Celsius with a burning duration of about 30 minutes or less, while the fires burning in the duff layer reach 400 degrees Celsius after 18 hours of combustion. When surface fires burn, the flaming front will generally consume smaller amounts of fine dead fuel from the ground level up to about 6 feet. Wind, slope, Shape of the terrain and available fuel will control a surface fire's direction and rate of spread. The time of active combustion and direct flame impingement is very short, so there is little to no heat buildup as grass and brush fires burn. Surface fires are measured in area, a two-dimensional measurement that is represented by the fire having burned a thin layer of materials on top of the ground. In contrast, a ground fire has no flaming front, and combustion is limited by oxygen availability and moisture content of the duff layer. Except for fuel moisture, the factors that influence surface fires do not have the same impact on ground fires. Ground fires burn much slower in denser fuels, resulting in gradual buildup of significant heat in the unburned duff layer and larger combustible materials, and also adjacent rocks and mineral soil. Ground fires can be measured as having burned a three-dimensional fuel package, where the volume of materials has both depth and area. The scene on the right is a ground fire that started at an old log landing in May of 2017 in Pollitt. A tree whose base was buried in logging debris was struck by lightning, and this ignited a ground fire. The ground fire consumed a large volume of materials and burned for several weeks. So once successful ignition occurs and the heat is transferred to receptive fuels, a ground fire's smoldering front begins to burn downward and laterally if conditions are favorable for sustained smoldering. As smoldering progresses, it creates a bowl-shaped depression in the ground fuels. Lateral spread, most often below the surface, becomes the dominant form of spread once downward spread reaches mineral soil or materials with moisture content that is too high. As the fire spreads laterally, it evaporates moisture and raises dry organic material up to combustion temperatures, allowing smoldering combustion to continue. Lateral fire spread continues unless the leading edge reaches non-combustible materials. In general, ground fires occur more frequently in ground fuels composed of needle litter due to their chemical composition and higher flammability. Some ground fires have self-extinguished as they burned into a duff layer of hardwood leaves. Due to the very long return intervals of wildland fire in Vermont, the duff layers in some forests can be very deep. Firefighters should be cautious about the potential for a ground fire to transition to a surface fire. After fall foliage season, a ground fire could smolder and creep below the forest floor until it encounters fuels that allow it to burn up to surface fuels, such as leaf litter. Depending on wind direction, slope position, and terrain features, this fire could quickly burn through surface fuels. Once a ground fire becomes well established, it generally burns through the lower level of the duff layer first, even in shallow ground fuels. As the fire nears the surface of the duff layer, the smoldering front will not spread as rapidly because of heat losses to the open air at ground level. Unburned material will overhang burned out ground fuels. This short video shows the heat and the leading edge of a ground fire burning at the lowest levels of the duff layer. Applying water on the top of the duff layer would not have a big impact on this fire. Using hand tools like a combi tool, Pulaski, or hazel hoe to cut away past the duff where the ground fire is creeping and then applying water is a better option to fully extinguish the fire. This short clip is from that same log landing fire back in May of 2017 in Pollitt, and is taken a good 20 hours after lightning struck the tree. There's tremendous heat in the 100 and 1,000 hour fuels as the ground fire undercuts the fuel bed. The ash piles in the foreground still have a lot of smoldering materials and are very hot. So far we've covered weather patterns, ground fire causes, and fire behavior found on ground fires. Let's move on to ground fire suppression. As already mentioned, expect that a fire off the beaten path when conditions are dry to be a ground fire. Ground fires in remote locations can be difficult to detect. The first operational period could be spent simply locating the fire after a report of a smoke. Plan ahead for mutual aid for sufficient manpower over the next few days. You can call the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation for assistance. Have size-up considerations in place before scouting for this fire, such as dimensions of the fire, how deep is it burning, is it burning in softwoods or hardwoods or a mix, are there dead or hollow trees present, is fire burning up and underneath the trees, is this ground fire in rocky or ledgy ground. The firefighter doing the size-up should visualize firefighters working in pairs with hand tools and water. Can this be done safely? And how many firefighters are needed? How long did it take to access this fire? Make sure you leave the fire with enough time to hike out in daylight or twilight. Difficult or remote access usually gives a ground fire a head start. There is little smoke production in the early stages of a ground fire. Once a ground fire is established, it will emit enough smoke to be visible and then get called in. By this point, there will be accumulated heat, and if the duff layer is deep, there will be a large volume of smoldering material to extinguish. Ground fires start and burn during periods of drought, so every piece of smoldering material must be extinguished. Fuel conditions that allow the fire to start and maintain combustion, often with limited oxygen, will allow any small bits of unextinguished ground fuel to burn and continue to spread. All of the duff should be considered capable of maintaining combustion and must be extinguished. A safety briefing should include acknowledgement that suppression will be slow and tedious. The fire area may not be very large in a two-dimensional area, but the amount of materials that are smoldering could be substantial in 3 dimensions. A hand-dug fire line to mineral soil will require a lot of effort, especially if roots from regeneration or shrubs or brush are present. All decomposing logs and stumps are also available fuel. Ground fuels can carry fire through rock crevices and into hollow logs or trees. And ground fires never seem to burn in areas without lots of rocks or ledge. The best tools for ground fire suppression are the ones that can chop or grub or dig out the duff layer. Expect roots in the duff layer, usually forming a mat that will need to be cut through to get down to mineral soil. Unlike constructing a fire line to stop a surface fire, firefighters should remove materials ahead of the leading edge of a ground fire and pull those materials back into the burned area. It may be too hot to work in the burned or still smoldering area. If this is the case, firefighters should cut away all materials down to mineral soil and throw those removed materials back into the fire's interior, but not close to the fire's perimeter. The ground fire will likely be burning farther back under the top layer of the duff than what the smoke is showing you. Your work should start about 8 to 12 inches away from the visible burned edge to make sure you find the farthest reaches of this ground fire undercutting the forest floor. If there is no water available, you should use your hand tool to cut fire line into the ground fuels and locate mineral soil to mix and grind and stir all of the ground fuel pieces until they are extinguished. You'll have to take off your glove to cold trail, looking for heat using the back of your hand. This next video segment was made at the Arrowhead Mountain Fire in Milton in October of 2020. Dan Dillner from the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation will demonstrate safe and effective methods for dry mopping, the process of extinguishing a ground fire without water.
All right, we're going to dig out this ground fire to show you a little bit how to do this. You see the stuff smoking here, it's just the duff burning right on top. Now it'll continue to smoke until we get a lot of precipitation. The only way you're going to put this out is to actually dig it out. So kind of like mixing concrete in a wheelbarrow. You got to mix and chop and scrape. You can spray a lot of water on this, not going to do much. So we're going to dig it out. Going to chop the roots, open this right up. What you don't want to do is just bury it up with the duff. If you're lucky, you can get a little bit of dirt, that mineral soil, and mix it right in. Chop those roots out of the way. The roots will actually carry fire. Burn right in the duff. The rocks really hold the heat. Sometimes you can move a few of the rocks into the black and let them cool off a bit. If you get a little pack pump, you can squirt just a little water, kind of mix around in this. Look at all these little smokes, you gotta put them out. Kind of chop and mix and scrape and smother that out.
The rocks underneath.
Don't be afraid.
Boiling.
Don't be afraid to get on your hands and knees and get right down here and bust open some of this stuff. And use the back of your hand with a cold trail too for some hot spots. Don't burn yourself. Right down in here. That's what you want. You want to get some of this. See that? Mineral soil. That's what you want. If you can get down into there, that's not going to carry the fire, and you can use that to help put the fire out. It's called dry mopping. A lot of places out west, that might be all you have. It's a lot of work to do, but it's sometimes less work than coming all the way back up to the fire multiple days. You can even get some of this soil out, and then I can smother the fire. Smokes over here. We watch it, make sure you don't spread fire. Sometimes I sit for a minute to see where the smoke starts poking up again. We got another little smoke right here. All it is a little crumb, a little bit of that dry duff kind of smoking along. But you leave that, sun and wind hits that, pretty soon you got embers glowing, start burning into the duff, and then you get enough wind, it could throw embers outside your line. If you're gonna put it out, it's really the only way to do it. Even if you have a hose and a lot of water, you still got to open this up, otherwise it's just not going to penetrate down in. Still got a little more heat on this side. That actual mineral soil on it. Mix it around. Good. Dig into it. A little warm there. After you think you got it, just wait a couple minutes, see if you get more smokes, and then, if it's right on the edge, this is interior a little ways, but if it's right on the very edge, I'd maybe come back in about a half an hour, poke it again, just to be sure, because otherwise it's just going to continue to flare up on you and give you problems and make you have to come back. But I think it looks like we got it.
If you find the ground fire is burned deep into the duff layer, or there's a considerable amount of ground fuels burning, setting up a hose lay can be worth the time and effort. Coordination between the local fire departments and the Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation can deliver water to remote locations. The Department of Forest Parks and Recreation's fire program has specialized pumps designed to push water up into the woods, and local fire departments can quickly set up a water source for these pumps using a portable tank and establishing a tanker shuttle. On this fire in Happy Hollow in Bolton, one of Forest Parks and Recreation's pumps pushed water up 200 feet in elevation through a hose lay of over 2,000 feet and provided enough pressure to run 2 nozzles. Having a steady and reliable flow of water makes ground fire suppression much easier. But remember that water applied only to the forest floor above a ground fire will not extinguish this fire. The water is not likely to penetrate the duff layer down to the ground fire before it either evaporates or is absorbed by the upper layer of the duff. The heat of a smoldering ground fire below will evaporate that water and eventually make that fuel available for combustion. You must use hand tools to give water access down into a ground fire. If backpack pumps are your only source of water at the fire scene, use that water sparingly. Work the fire's edge with a hand tool first, cutting apart and pulling apart the ground fuels so that water can be applied directly. Apply enough water to just wet those fuels and then mix and stir the fuels into mineral soil. Water should be considered the finishing touch and not a primary tool for putting out a ground fire, especially if it's being carried on your back. Murphy's Law states that the water source is always downhill from the fire, so the less trips back up carrying a full backpack pump, the better. Even though there's a lack of excitement and fast action when working on a ground fire, firefighters must always keep safety in mind. Wildland smoke contains several compounds of concern, including carbon monoxide, benzene, formaldehyde, and the visible part of smoke is made up of particulate matter of various sizes. Smoldering fires also release methane, ammonia, and sulfur dioxide. Smoldering combustion can produce several times more mass of pollutants compared to a fire in which the majority of the fuel is being consumed in a flaming phase. Ground fire spread is very slow, so firefighters can potentially be working in the same smoky areas for long periods of time. Be sure to schedule time to get out of the smoke and into the fresh air. Carbon monoxide displaces oxygen in your bloodstream and requires several hours of breathing fresh air to completely rid it from your system. Being colorless and odorless, carbon monoxide can start to affect a firefighter without them being aware of it. Symptoms of carbon monoxide exposure include headaches, dizziness, nausea, loss of mental acuity, and fatigue. Prolonged high exposure can cause confusion and loss of consciousness. Keep an eye on yourself and your fellow firefighters to avoid undue carbon monoxide exposure. On any type of fire, there is always the potential for burns. Cold trailing, which is feeling for heat with the back of your ungloved hands, or moving hot materials away from the fire line, exposes a firefighter to potential burn injuries on a ground fire. The high temperature from prolonged smoldering in ground fuels can burn a firefighter's feet and hands, even through leather. Steam injuries from water applications onto very hot surfaces are also a concern. Ground fires can easily compromise trees by burning through or into their root systems. Watch for trees rocking and the ground around trees pitching and heaving when there's wind. Avoid working in these areas if possible, or cut these trees down if it can be done safely. Ground fires can burn up and into the base of hollow trees and weaken the trees from the inside out. Watch for trees that have burned through at the base. These are hazardous trees. Do not work in the area where these trees can fall. Cut down the tree if it can be done safely. Also, hot embers from inside of fallen trees close to the fire perimeter can spread fire outside the control line. Ground fires burning down into pockets of fuel, such as stump holes or root holes, are dangerous. These holes can maintain a lot of heat and pose a tripping or burning hazard to a firefighter. Mop-up is the final stage of fire suppression. Mop-up includes continuing to dig out all smoldering materials using hand tools and mixing them with water if available, or mixing them into exposed mineral soil if no water is available. A solid, complete fire line is the best defense against the ground fire continuing to creep through the duff. Because the process of extinguishing a ground fire is slow and tedious, and you've been working in a small area, it may feel as though you've been in mop-up mode the entire time you've been at the fire. But the purpose of mop-up is to leave the fire in a state where it is completely extinguished, or will not rekindle and pose a hazard. Do not depend on application of water on the leaf or needle layer above a ground fire. Because any particle of duff should be considered a means to carry fire, firefighters must cold trail the edge of the entire fire. This means using the back of your bare hand to feel for any heat along the edge of the fire, making sure to check the entire depth of the duff from the forest floor down to mineral soil. This could be only 1 to 2 inches deep, but it may be a foot or more. Any detection of heat means that section of duff should be cut out and pulled back into the interior of the fire. If water is available, it should be applied after the duff is cut out and removed. Then cold trail that section again. Before you leave the fire scene, allow enough time to recheck areas that were worked earlier in the day to check for smokes. If in doubt that the ground fire is completely extinguished, plan to revisit the burn the following day. Bring a friend and a hand tool and a backpack pump. Be prepared to do just more than a visual inspection of the fire. You should be cold trailing any problem areas. A thermal imaging camera may be useful to pick up any residual heat when returning the next day. Prioritize the area where the ground fire was the most difficult to suppress, such as places with the deepest duff or rocky areas. A good soaking rain or snowfall in the days following suppression and patrolling the fire site is always helpful. Thank you for watching this presentation on ground fire suppression made by the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation's fire staff. For assistance on wildland fires, please call the Vermont Emergency Management Duty Officer at 1-800-347-0488. Again, thank you.